The first thing I noticed when I woke up was the nothingness. Not the soft blur of light or dark shadows I had taken for granted, but a complete, suffocating void. My heart raced, and I reached out, clawing at the space around me. I felt the cool metal of the hospital bed's railing, the sterile, slick texture of the sheets beneath my hands. But I couldn't see. "Miss Bennett?" A man's voice interrupted my spiraling thoughts. Calm, detached. "I'm Dr. Edwards. Please don't panic." "Why can't I see?" My voice cracked, desperation seeping through each word. "What's wrong with me?" The pause that followed felt like an eternity. "You've suffered severe retinal damage. The injury was consistent with trauma," he explained. "It caused irreparable damage to your optic nerves. I'm sorry, but the blindness is permanent." "Trauma?" The word echoed in my head as the memories came rushing back. It was Clara, my perfect, untouchable younger sister, the golden child with her spotless reputation. She had stood above me at the top of the stairs, her face twisted with rage. I'd only wanted answers. Why she always had to belittle me. Why she constantly undermined me in front of our parents. "You think you're so much better than me, don't you?" she'd screamed. I didn't see the push coming, just the sharp sensation of falling, the world spinning, until the hard impact stole my breath and consciousness. "An accident?" Clara had sobbed later. I heard her voice in my head as I lay in that sterile bed. She'd clung to my mother, tears soaking her designer blouse, painting herself as the victim. I didn't mean to. I just wanted her to stop yelling. I wasn't yelling. I had been begging. The sound of my parents entering my hospital room yanked me out of my thoughts. I could hear my mother's heels clicking on the tiles, her voice pitched with false sympathy. "Oh, sweetie," she said, the tone brittle enough to shatter. "How are you feeling?" How was I feeling? I wanted to scream, but I bit my lip. The anger caught in my throat. "I can't see," I whispered. "Dr. Edwards says she'll need time to adjust," my father interjected, his tone businesslike as if discussing a faulty appliance. "You'll adapt, Lila. You've always been resilient." Resilient. That was code for inconvenient. Clara's footsteps followed, hesitant, calculated. I felt her presence before she spoke, her saccharine voice dripping with insincerity. "Lila," Clara said, her voice trembling, "I'm so sorry. If I could take it back, I would. You have to believe me." I clenched my fists. Her hand brushed my arm, but the contact felt like poison. I pulled away instinctively. "You know she didn't mean to hurt you," my mother added, defensive as always when it came to Clara. "Clara's been under so much pressure with school. Speaking of which," her tone brightened unnaturally, "you'll never guess what happened. Clara won the president's scholarship. Isn't that amazing?" I felt the breath leave me as if someone had punched me. I was blind, my entire life upended, and all they could talk about was Clara's next accolade? I stayed silent, biting back tears as the conversation shifted to her acceptance speeches, her plans for the gala. After a few minutes, they left, promising to return soon. Clara lingered for a moment. "I'll do whatever I can to help," she murmured before stepping out. The faint smirk in her voice didn't go unnoticed. Being blind didn't just steal my sight. It stole my independence, my ability to exist without relying on people who didn't care if I lived or died. The house I'd grown up in, once a place of refuge, became a labyrinth of dangers. The furniture seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. Corners I had memorized became ambushes waiting to trip or bruise me. I tried boiling water for tea one afternoon and burned my hand when I reached too far. The kettle screamed, but not louder than I did. Clara became the appointed helper. She'd drop by my room, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Do you need anything, Lila?" she'd ask, already halfway out the door. Her tone was honey-coated malice, a reminder of the power she wielded now. But her visits weren't for my benefit. I overheard her on the phone once, her voice muffled through the thin walls. "You should see her stumble around," Clara said with a quiet laugh. "She always thought she was better than me. Now she can finally see how helpless she really is." Those words cut deeper than the darkness ever could. I felt them like a knife twisting in my chest. My parents were no better. They flitted around the house, busy with their own lives, dismissing my struggles as though they were a phase I'd grow out of. "You've got to move on," my father had said one evening at dinner. Sitting around feeling sorry for yourself won't change anything. I stayed silent, letting the lump in my throat suffocate any reply. My mother, as always, was too distracted by Clara's achievements to notice. Every conversation revolved around her upcoming gala, the awards, the praise she was set to receive. In their eyes, I was no longer a person. I was a shadow, an afterthought, something to be swept aside while they basked in Clara's light. My family had taken everything from me: my sight, my dignity, my sense of self. But as I sat alone in the suffocating darkness, I began to feel something stir within me. It wasn't just anger, it was resolve. They thought they had broken me. They thought I would stay silent. They were wrong. I couldn't stay in the house a moment longer. The air felt suffocating, thick with Clara's false kindness and my parents' unspoken disappointment. So, late one evening, I grabbed my cane and ventured out, the blind woman alone in a world she couldn't see. The city sounded different at night, hushed but alive, like a creature holding its breath. I navigated by memory and instinct, counting steps and listening for familiar cues. The buzz of the lampposts, the distant hum of traffic. But my steps faltered as I reached the edge of an intersection, where the sound of cars became a roar. I hesitated, panic rising like bile in my throat. Before I could move, a horn blared, the sound slicing through me. I stepped forward instinctively, only to feel a strong hand grab my arm and yank me back. "Careful," a man's voice said, sharp with concern. "You almost walked into traffic." I clutched at him, trembling. I didn't realize." His hand stayed firm on my arm, steadying me. "You're blind," he said, not as a question but a statement. His tone was calm, matter of fact. "What are you doing out here alone?" I wanted to retort, to defend my fragile independence, but my words caught in my throat. "I needed to get away," I muttered. He didn't press further. "Come on," he said instead. "Let's get you somewhere safe." We ended up at a quiet cafe, its warmth a stark contrast to the chill of the night. He introduced himself as Elijah, his voice low and soothing. I told him my name hesitantly, unsure why I felt compelled to share anything with this stranger. But something about him, his quiet strength, the way he didn't pity me, made me trust him. As we talked, I found myself spilling my story: the accident, Clara's lies, my parents' indifference. He listened without interrupting, his silence more comforting than any empty words could have been. When I finally stopped, he spoke. "What if I told you there's a chance you could see again?" The words hung in the air, unreal. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice tinged with both hope and skepticism. "I work with advanced medical research," Elijah explained. "There's an experimental procedure we've been developing, something that might restore your vision. It's not guaranteed, but it's possible." The weight of his offer was staggering. "Why would you do that for me? You don't even know me." He hesitated, then said, "Because I know what it's like to feel abandoned by the people who should care about you. And because I believe you deserve a chance to take your life back." The next weeks passed in a surreal blur. Elijah arranged everything with precision and discretion, guiding me through the process as though I were the only person in the world who mattered. His foundation covered the costs, and the medical team treated me like a VIP, their quiet efficiency reassuring me even as fear threatened to take hold. The surgery itself was a haze of drugs and muffled voices. When I woke, the world was still dark. My heart sank, the crushing weight of failure pressing down on me. "It takes time," Elijah reminded me gently. "Healing isn't instant." Days later, I opened my eyes to a blurry wash of colors. Shapes gradually sharpened, the world coming into focus like a masterpiece unveiled. For the first time in what felt like forever, I could see. I could see everything. I cried then, the tears spilling unchecked down my cheeks. Elijah was the first person I saw clearly, his sharp features and piercing gray eyes watching me with quiet intensity. "It worked," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I can see." But my joy was tempered by the knowledge of what I had to do next. "I need to keep this a secret," I told him firmly. "My family, they can't know." He frowned, clearly not understanding. Why? Because they'll never let me be free if they know I've regained my sight. I need to stay in the shadows until I'm ready to step into the light, on my terms. He didn't argue, instead he nodded, his eyes holding a quiet respect for my resolve. Regaining my vision was only the first step. Seeing was easy. Navigating the world as someone who had once been blind was another matter entirely. Elijah became my guide, teaching me how to move with confidence, how to mask my newfound sight from others. He introduced me to new tools, new ways of thinking, until I felt more capable than I ever had before. But it wasn't just the practical lessons that changed me, it was Elijah himself, his unwavering belief in me, his quiet encouragement. He never asked for anything in return, never tried to control or pity me. For the first time in my life, I felt seen, truly seen, by someone who valued me for who I was. One evening, as we sat on a park bench watching the sunset, he turned to me. "What are you going to do now, Lila, now that you can see?" I hesitated, the weight of my plan heavy on my mind. "I'm going to take back what's mine," I said finally, "and I'm going to make them pay for what they did." Elijah studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Revenge is a heavy burden to carry," he said softly. "Are you sure it's worth it?" "It's not revenge," I corrected him. "It's justice." His lips twitched in the faintest of smiles. "Then let me help you." I shook my head. "You've done enough. This is something I need to do on my own." But as I looked at him, my resolve faltered. For the first time since I'd lost everything, I felt a flicker of something dangerous, something I couldn't afford to feel. Trust. Elijah's hand brushed mine, his touch warm and steady. "You're stronger than you think, Lila, and whatever happens, you won't face it alone." I wanted to believe him, but I knew that to see my plan through, I couldn't let anyone get too close, not even him. I had been pretending to be blind for weeks now, and honestly, it was starting to feel like second nature. People always underestimate you when they think you're helpless. My family was no exception. Late one night, I slipped into my father's study. I still bumped into the door frame on purpose, just in case someone was nearby. You never know when Clara might be lurking. The room smelled of leather and cigars, a reminder of the man who thought he owned everyone under his roof. I carefully felt my way to the desk, letting my fingertips graze the surface, as if I were blindly searching for something. In reality, my eyes locked onto the stack of papers he'd left out. Jackpot! I pulled out my phone and quietly snapped pictures of the bank statements. Transfers, withdrawals, and weird transactions labeled as campaign expenses. It didn't take a genius to figure out what was going on. They'd been stealing Clara's scholarship funds to pay for their fancy dinners and my dad's political dreams. My heart pounded as I worked. They thought they had me in the dark, literally. But now, I had the light. The next day, I found more. Clara had left her phone lying on the kitchen counter, probably too busy basking in her own glow to notice. I picked it up, pretending to accidentally swipe through the screen. Inside her gallery were texts and screenshots I'd only dreamed of finding. She'd sent emails to people calling me mentally unstable, unfit, and a burden. One of them even bragged about how easy it had been to make me disappear into the background. The real kicker was a voice memo she'd sent to a friend. "Lila always thought she was better than me. Well, look at her now, helpless, blind, nothing without me." That was the moment it all clicked. Clara wasn't just cruel, she was calculating. She hadn't just pushed me that day, she'd planned my fall. I wasn't going to let this slide, I wasn't going to let them slide. "Elijah," I said one evening as we sat in his apartment, my voice steady, "I have everything I need." He looked up from his laptop. "Everything?" I nodded. "The money they stole, Clara's lies, even the push." I paused, a bitter smile curling my lips. "They thought they broke me. They're about to learn how wrong they were." Elijah leaned forward, his eyes sharp. "What's the plan?" We worked late into the night. He had connections I didn't even know existed. Lawyers, journalists, people who knew how to turn secrets into weapons. Together, we prepared an anonymous tip for the authorities. It detailed every shady transaction, every forged document, every dollar that wasn't theirs to take. It didn't stop there. I sent Clara's emails and texts to her school anonymously, attaching screenshots of her behavior. No one likes a bully, especially not one who plays dirty. By the time we were done, I felt lighter, almost giddy. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about finally standing up for myself. They're going to crack, Elijah said, leaning back in his chair. People like them always do when the truth comes out. I didn't doubt it for a second. A few nights later, I decided it was time. Clara was in her room, scrolling through her phone like the queen of her own tiny kingdom. I knocked on the door lightly and walked in without waiting for her to answer. She looked up startled. Lila, what are you doing here? I smiled, calm, steady, but sharp enough to cut. We need to talk. Clara shifted in her chair, her confidence slipping just a little. About what? I stepped closer. About the stairs? About the push? Her face froze, her eyes wide. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't lie to me, Clara. My voice was soft, almost a whisper, but each word landed like a punch. I know you did it. I know you've been sabotaging me for years, and I know you've been using me as your scapegoat. She tried to laugh it off, but it came out shaky. You're imagining things, Lila. You've always been dramatic. I leaned down, getting in her face. I heard the voice memo. Helpless, blind, nothing without me. Those were your words, weren't they? Clara's bravado shattered. She stood up abruptly, knocking her chair over. What do you want from me? She snapped, her voice high and desperate. I straightened, crossing my arms. I don't want anything, but I'll tell you this. You've always wanted everything I had. My independence, my intelligence, my life. And now, Clara, I'm taking it all back. You'll have nothing. Her face paled as I turned and walked out, leaving her alone with her crumbling world. I was back at Elijah's place, sitting on the couch with a glass of wine in my hand. The thrill of that confrontation was still fresh, like adrenaline buzzing under my skin. You're enjoying this, Elijah said, watching me with an amused expression. I shrugged, taking a sip. Wouldn't you? He laughed softly, shaking his head. You're something else, Lila. We sat in comfortable silence for a while. Then, out of nowhere, he said, I admire you, you know? I looked at him surprised. Admire me? You've been through hell, and you're still standing. You're not just standing, you're fighting. Most people would have given up. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. My grip tightened on the glass. I don't know if I'm capable of love anymore, I admitted quietly. Not after everything they've done to me. Elijah leaned forward, his voice steady and calm. You don't need to love to destroy. Sometimes, that's enough. I stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. He understood me in a way no one else ever had. Maybe he'd been through something similar, or maybe he was just as broken as I was. Either way, I felt a strange sense of comfort in his presence. Thank you, I said softly, setting the glass down. For what? For being here. He didn't say anything, just reached out and took my hand. We sat like that for a long time, the silence between us saying more than words ever could. The ballroom was buzzing with chatter and laughter. Glittering chandeliers hung overhead, and everything screamed wealth and perfection. Typical of my parents. They'd go all out to make Clara look like the star of the universe. I adjusted my dress, sleek and black, nothing flashy but enough to make people notice. Elijah stood beside me, calm as ever, like this was just another day. You ready for this? He asked, glancing at me. I took a breath. Ready as I'll ever be. We stepped in, heads turned immediately. Some people whispered, a few gasped. My parents and Clara didn't notice me at first. They were too busy soaking up the attention. Clara especially looked radiant in her sparkly dress, grinning like she'd just won an Oscar. It wasn't until I got closer to the stage that Clara's smile faltered. She saw me, and her expression shifted to something between shock and irritation. My parents followed her gaze, and their faces went pale. For the first time in years, I felt like I had the upper hand. The room quieted as I grabbed the microphone from the MC. My voice rang clear, steady. Good evening, everyone! I know this night is meant to celebrate Clara's achievements, but I thought I'd share a little family story, to make things interesting. Clara stiffened, her eyes darting to our parents. My father's jaw clenched, and my mother fumbled with her champagne glass. Elijah stood at the edge of the crowd, watching like a hawk, his presence grounding me. I pulled out the documents, photocopies of bank statements, fake invoices, and proof of their crimes. The projector lit up behind me, displaying everything for the entire room to see. For years, my parents have been stealing money from Clara's scholarships, from donors, even from charities, all while pretending to be the perfect family. But tonight, the truth comes out. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. Reporters who'd been there to cover Clara's graduation gala were already snapping pictures and recording. Clara stormed up to the stage, her face red. "What are you doing, Lila?" she hissed, grabbing my arm. "You're ruining everything." I shook her off. "No, Clara. I'm just showing everyone who you all really are." Her voice rose, shaky with panic. "You planned this! You've always been jealous of me!" I turned to her, my voice calm but cutting. "Jealous? You blinded me, Clara. You pushed me down those stairs, and then you stood there pretending to care while my life fell apart. And now? Now I've had enough." Her eyes widened, and she froze. For a second, I thought she might cry, but instead she sneered, her desperation showing. "You're lying. Nobody will believe you." I stepped closer, lowering my voice so only she could hear. "Oh, they'll believe me. You see, Clara, I'm not blind anymore. I saw everything. And now so will they." Before she could respond, the sound of sirens cut through the air. Police officers entered the ballroom, walking straight to my parents. My father tried to keep his composure, but sweat beaded on his forehead. My mother clutched his arm, trembling. "Mr. and Mrs. Reed," one officer said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "you're under arrest for embezzlement and tax fraud." As they were handcuffed, my mother turned to me, tears streaming down her face. "Lila, please, we're your family. Don't do this." I met her gaze, my voice cold. "Family? A real family doesn't ignore their daughter's pain. A real family doesn't blind her or steal her future. You're strangers to me now." My father tried to speak, but I cut him off. "Save it. You brought this on yourselves." After the chaos, the ballroom cleared out quickly. People couldn't get away fast enough, eager to distance themselves from the scandal. I stood by the balcony staring at the city lights, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and emptiness. Elijah joined me, leaning on the railing. "You did it," he said simply. I nodded, but something in his tone made me turn to him. "What is it? You've been quiet all night." He hesitated, then sighed. "There's something I need to tell you. I didn't just stumble into your life by chance. I've been investigating your family for a while. Their corruption goes deeper than you know, and my foundation has been working to expose them." I blinked, the weight of his words sinking in. "So, what? Helping me was part of your plan?" "At first, yes," he admitted. "But then I got to know you, and everything changed. You're not just a victim, Lila. You're brilliant, strong, and honestly, terrifying. I admire that." I stared at him, unsure how to feel. Part of me wanted to be angry, but I couldn't. I knew Elijah. He wasn't like my family. He didn't lie to hurt me. He lied to help me. And maybe in his own way, he cared. Finally, I said, "You could have told me sooner." He smiled faintly. "Would you have believed me?" I sighed. "Probably not." We stood there in silence for a while, the city alive below us. For the first time in years, I felt free. In the weeks that followed, my parents' trial became a media circus. Every dirty secret they'd buried was unearthed, and their empire crumbled. Clara tried to salvage her reputation, but it was too late. No one wanted anything to do with the golden child who turned out to be tarnished. I, on the other hand, thrived. With Elijah's help, I secured my rightful share of the family assets, ensuring I would never have to depend on anyone again. The house, the cars, the money. It was all mine now, and I made sure my parents and Clara knew it. Clara tried to reach out once, begging for forgiveness. I met her at a cafe, listening to her excuses, her sob story about how she'd always felt overshadowed. When she finally finished, I leaned in and said, "You're right, Clara. You'll never be like me. and now you'll never have anything I do. I walked away, leaving her sitting there, tears streaming down her face. It should have felt satisfying, but all I felt was a strange sort of relief, like I'd finally closed a door I never wanted to open again. Months later, Elijah and I stood on a rooftop overlooking the city. The air was crisp, and the stars were bright above us. "You've come a long way," he said, his voice soft. "So have you," I replied, glancing at him. "You're not as mysterious as you used to be." He chuckled. "And you're not as guarded." We stood there in silence, side by side. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, I felt ready to face it. "This is just the beginning," I said, a small smile playing on my lips. Elijah took my hand, squeezing it gently. "And you're just getting started."